agreed to, and the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is now recognized to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the discussion draft of October 1, offered by Mr. Posey of Florida. Page 60.
I ask that the amendment be considered as read. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would hope that all members of this committee could agree that any more efforts to improve the enforcement capabilities of the Securities and Exchange Commission would be a welcome one, and I don't know that we need to spend a whole time going over all the SEC's problems. As the House Committee of Jurisdiction for such a crisis, we've become very familiar with the recent failures of the SEC, particularly with the...
I'd ask them to move the microphone closer, Tim. I think there's some difference. Thank you.
I'm sorry. How's that, Mr. Chairman?
Fine.
As we know, the mission to the SEC is to maintain fair and orderly markets and to protect investors from fraud. Vital to the SEC's effectiveness is its enforcement authority, yet every year the Commission obtains judgments or orders for millions of dollars in penalties and disgorgements, which many of the violators refuse to pay. Mr. Chairman, no doubt the SEC is in need of serious reform, and my amendment would help the SEC enforcement staff focus on investigating and apprehending securities law violators by authorizing the SEC, when appropriate, to outsource the collection of penalties and disgorgements that the Commission has not been able to obtain. This is a win-win for the SEC and for investors because it helps ensure collections are made while enabling SEC resources to be more effectively focused on preventing securities fraud. I ask my colleagues for their support of this amendment.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Posey opposes a very interesting amendment that maybe 3 or 4 years ago would have been very worthwhile, but we've inquired of the SEC, and in the last several years, they've examined their success in collection of prior obligations, and they went from about 10 years ago of being in the 40% category to now being in the 77% category. They feel internally they are capable of doing that or referring the matter to the FMS, and they now are in opposition to and no longer request the authority. So on the basis of that, I would oppose the amendment.
Is there further debate? Well, the gentleman's used up his time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania yield to the gentleman from...
Oh, yes, definitely, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is not a mandate. This just gives the SEC that flexibility. It doesn't require them to do this. It gives them just one more enforcement tool, totally at the SEC's option.
I would recognize myself to say I appreciate that, but I think this is a decision that we ought to make. And there are sensitivities, obviously, about privacy and about law enforcement when you're talking about collection, for example, whether or not private citizens do that. There are clear safeguards that occur when it's a public entity. So I would be, I'm opposed to the amendment. I understand it just gives the SEC the authority, but at this point I'm not ready to give them the authority. I should know that the employees union is strongly opposed to it. And in addition to their particular interest, again, we are talking about some fairly sensitive functions that I am very reluctant to have them delegate to private citizens. Is there further debate? Gentleman from New Jersey.
Well, I wish to speak in favor of the amendment. And the point that sold me on it was your last point, that it is entirely voluntary by the SEC. I appreciate the gentleman from Pennsylvania saying that they've increased from 40% up to 70 or 77%. Well, in my book, that's good, but it seems as though they have a ways to go. And I would hope in this day and age, as we've both said from both sides of the aisle, that we need to do everything we can for the economy and the taxpayer, that they would try to find the most efficient and effective method within the confines, as the chairman says, with propriety to private information. And I think that we certainly contract out in a number of other areas where you're dealing with confidential information, and there are security clearances and everything else you can impose on them. And I'm not sure the minutia with regard to the SEC, but I'm sure that can all be handled effectively if we put it in the capable hands of the SEC to administer outside. So I think the gentleman is looking out for the taxpayer, looking out for the most effective way to get it done. And if the SEC in their wisdom says that it should be done, then we should allow them the prerogative to do so. So I will yield to the gentleman to comment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where I'm from, a 70 percentile is still a D. You know, they could drop 1 point less and they get an F where I'm from. I think we should, in looking at discouragement, this is taxpayers' money that's going uncollected because of our inability to collect it. And I think in the best interest of the taxpayers, we should do whatever it takes to recover that money. When people can violate the law and know that there's no penalty for it, you are just encouraging more of the same behavior in the future. So I think any effort to help enforce the law, enforce the crimes against people like Bernard Madoff and others that have performed illegal activities, they've been caught, they've been convicted, they've been adjudicated liable for these damages, and we only collect 70% of them. I think it's a travesty, and I think it's a travesty if we don't do everything that we can to make them more accountable for the people who put us here.
The question is on the amendment.
Just reclaiming my time, then, on that point, I think that's an interesting argument as well. You make a couple of number of good points. If we were to have a panel discussion here, and we were to bring in the victims of the crime, not just Madoff, but all the other crimes that occur out there, and it's interesting, since you've had all the disclosure, we've had more of these cases come to light. If we had a panel discussion here and bring in those victims, I'd be curious if we asked them, who are you more concerned about? Going after those victims and getting back every penny on the dollar you possibly can, or are you concerned about the unions and the public employees and making sure that that they have the jobs there? I would suggest that it's an easy.
The gentleman yield.
Sure.
First of all, it's irrelevant to Madoff. There's a trustee in bankruptcy who's turning people upside down, so that the Madoff case is unaffected by any of this. Secondly, I think it is unfair to the unions to suggest that they're only concerned with their jobs. They're also concerned with the effectiveness of enforcement, with the complexity, with civil liberties of individuals. It's easy when you have a crook like Madoff who's already been convicted, but some of this involves people who haven't been convicted and of contest. So, but I would again repeat, the Madoff case would not be covered by this as a trustee in bankruptcy who's got the plenary powers.
Reclaiming my time, and that's why I parsed my words carefully. I said Madoff-like cases. I did not say the Madoff case because I know that as a trustee in those situations they're going after them hard. But it's in Madoff-like cases, which means these Ponzi-type schemes where your people out there, they're going after them. And so that's...
Well, General, I understand he said Madoff-like, but the reason for saying Madoff-like is to try to import the emotion of the Madoff case where it's really not relevant.
Well, reclaiming my time, I think it's entirely relevant. I think whether you were taken for $1 million by Madoff or you were taken for $100,000 by one of these other Ponzi schemes, you put that person on that panel, they'll say, I don't care who I was taken by, which scam I was involved in, I'm still burnt by this, I'm hurt financially. If you have a senior citizen there, they don't care who took advantage of them. They just want to know that they were taken advantage of. They may have no retirement funds anymore, and they just want to know it gets done.
Well, the gentleman yield. Yeah, but that's the implicit assumption that it's more efficient to do it that way is one I reject. And I do think when you're talking about public responsibilities, collection and these other things, that people invested with public authority ought to be the ones to do it and do it fully.
And reclaiming my time, but you can reject or not reject it. We're just saying let the SEC have that authority to decide which is the most efficient manner to do it and get it. Well, I like that from 77. 77 to me is a C or C minus.
Gentlemen, would yield.
Well, let me just finish. So I would like to get it up to at least a B for those folks out there. I'll yield.
Question comes on the amendment. Those gentlemen, question comes on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The gentleman from Colorado is now recognized for Second Amendment.